For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. How do you know? I mean, just think about this for just a moment. How do you know anything? How do you know that today is Sunday? How do you know that today is Christmas Day? There's a whole field of study on how we know things. It's called epistemology. And it's the study of knowing. How do we know who we are and what we are and where we are? And by knowing, I might want to give you the definition that to know means to perceive with certainty. That may redefine what you actually know, because there's a lot of things that we know that we think we know that other people don't know what we know. And we try to convince them, then they have no idea of what we're trying to say to them. But before you go across that existential crisis that I'm leading you to, there's really a couple of ways, basically, that you and I know anything and know everything. One of them is experience. Many of us experience things all the time. I'm not even sure I spelled that word right, but that word's supposed to be experience. Maybe if you don't read it that way, then you can still experience it that way. But experience is what teaches us a lot of things, particularly things that we're not going to ever do again. Have you ever ridden one of those roller coasters and it looked like it was fun when you got on it, and about halfway through the middle of that you were praying that, Lord, I will never come near one of these things if you will just let me get off of here alive? Some of our experiences are things that I am never, ever going to do again. And some of our experiences are, you know what, I kind of like that ride. I think I'm going to do that again. It's all experience. Experience is a great teacher to us. We learn what to do. We learn what not to do, all by experience. But we can't experience everything, so we have to rely upon other people to tell us certain things. To tell us that there is a place called Africa for those of us who have not gone. To tell us that there is a time that you do graduate from high school and you graduate from college and the kids do finally leave. All those kinds of things that you may not have experienced yet, but someone tells you, and so you begin to believe them because you haven't experienced them, but someone tells you. And the best teacher of all is when you're able to combine those two things. Your parents ever told you not to do something, and then you decided to do that anyway, and you learned what they said, and you learned from your own experience, and that little light bulb finally went on? Oh, it's hot. Don't touch that stove. I'm okay, Daddy. Tss. I know something now. I know not to touch that, and maybe I know that I can trust the one who tells me. But imagine for just a moment if your perceptors were not operating correctly. Most of what we understand the world to be is that we've experienced it, and then oftentimes someone is there to explain to us the experience that we just had. But imagine if you could not see. Imagine if you could not hear. How dark that place would be, how alone you would feel, because there was no one speaking into your life to help you understand what you were thinking, what you were understand, what you were to explain, what you were processing. There was nobody there but you, yourself, and I, which can get a little crowded sometimes. Well, you may never have experienced that, but there is a person who lived, and you may not recognize the face of this person, though some of you might, but this is a person who experienced the deprivation of perception. Her name, of course, is Helen Keller, right? She was born just like you and I are, normally in all capacities, until about the age of 19 months. She came down with a virus, a disease, an illness, which robbed her of not only of her sight, but of her hearing as well. So the information that she had was very limited, because most of us look and see and experience. In fact, you're able to experience this today, and the lights and all the sounds contribute to your understanding of what's going on. But she had neither one of those perception opportunities, and she was just there by herself from 19 months old, and for the rest of her life never experienced sight, or, sorry to borrow the phrase, or sound in our lives. Until a person by the name of Anne Sullivan came into her life. Anne could not see very well herself. She had some vision problems, but she was placed in her relationship and through the home that she was involved in, going through Alexander Graham Bell and all those kind of connections, kind of fun how history works together. But Anne Sullivan decided that she would insert herself into Helen Keller's life. And she would figure out a way to communicate, to talk to give her perceptions, to help her have understanding. Those of you who have seen the movie The Miracle Worker or have read the book or who were alive during that time of Helen Keller's time and watched all this happen, so you might have seen that on television during those days. But Anne was able to finally, by writing letters into the palm of the hand of Helen Keller and be able to make the connection, put her hand underneath water and then spell out water. It was a tough process. In fact, it really was a miracle that she was able to finally communicate. But once she broke through, Helen Keller actually became a speaker and a writer and was able to share everything that she had experienced by herself with the world, and the world was a better place because of that. But it took someone going into her world to communicate, to share with her, and help her process and understand so that she might know anything. God had the same dilemma. He created the universe, and after 6 days of creating incredible things that we are still exploring and still can't understand, saves his final creation to the most important creation of all, and that was man. He was going to create somebody who was going to be like him, somebody who could think and process, somebody who was going to be creative, someone that he was going to have a relationship, and he saved his best for last, and he made man and woman, and God had relationship with them, walking side by side, communing, having conversation, being all connected in all kinds of ways that we can't even understand. Until man decided to sin. Man decided to reject what God had provided for him, this incredible relationship, this incredible planet, this incredible universe to explore. But man chose not to follow the ways of God, but instead decided that God was holding out on him, cheating him, and instead went and ate from that fruit and disobeyed God. And as a result of that, God's greatest creation was marred. In fact, that which was innocent, that was holy and righteous, which allowed him to have relationship with God, now had been destroyed. And now God, in order to protect the man, would have to send the man away. And God would have to hide in the shadows, because God's holy nature and his perfection is so intense that it cannot be in the same presence as sinfulness or unrighteousness. In fact, it would be just like the sun, the sun out there that's out in the sky. It would be like it showing up here in this room. It would annihilate all of us because its existence and our existence, its nature and our nature could not be in the same place at the same time. It would literally consume us. The perception of God by man had been destroyed. God couldn't even come near the presence. And so God had to hide in the shadows and hide in the corners and hide in the crevices and kind of speak a little bit to man, but couldn't interact with man, couldn't show up face to face, couldn't be there because of his holy nature and the sinful, broken nature of man. But God had a plan. His plan was that he was going to take an individual by the name of Abram and going to reorient him in his life. And he was going to become that leader and become that group of a family. And through that Abraham, he would set aside a people that God would have unique relationship, that God would pour all his knowledge into them. And he was going to do that ultimately through the law. And he calls out a guy by the name of Moses to be the one who brings the law, who bears the law, where God explains to people, to man, not only God's nature, but the nature of man. He talks about sin. He talks about sacrifice. He talks about the need for someone to go in between the two. And the law is set up for God's people, set apart from the world, to come to understand and to come to know God, even though their perception of Him has been irreparably destroyed and harmed. But the people who got the law, instead of learning more about who God is, instead of using that as a way to know who God is, they began to use it as a system of rules and regulations to keep the people down. Instead of understanding the importance of sacrifice and the importance of the ceremonial law and the importance of all the things in the Old Testament, instead of taking those and sharing them freely with all, there were some who were better than others who could keep that law just slightly better than the other people around there. And they began to use that to, instead of lifting people up, to keep people down. It can happen today to us as well. Those of us who are slightly better than some other people can look at them and go, man, how come they don't get their life straightened up and we're barely able to keep ours together? And so God began the second phase of His plan, and that was that He would be sending His Son, Jesus Christ, who wouldn't do away with the truth, wouldn't excuse the truth of sinfulness, wouldn't excuse the damage that had been done, but instead would bring grace, would bring mercy. He would keep the law that man had not been able to keep, and then He would transfer that perfection to those who would receive Him. And the only way that could be done is showing up here in a way that we would understand, in a way that we would comprehend, in a way that we could connect with, a way that would make sense to us. You see, God could never have been seen and can never be seen in His unrivaled majesty. There's no way to see how glorious and powerful this God is. As soon as we got a glimpse of that, because of our own sinfulness, we would be destroyed. And so what God did is God Himself, the only God, the only begotten, the only Son of God, who was God in the beginning. This whole John chapter 1 is related to this whole story, unveiling what's going on here, that God who is at the Father's side, who is with the Father, would make the Father known. It would take God personified to make God known to us. We sing that song at Christmas time, veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. This word for make Him known is very interesting. We, in the Bible world, love that word because that's the word that we get the word exegete from, exegetical, exegesis. It's the idea that your pastor and you, when you study the Scriptures, are to take from what is inside that and exegete it, to interpret it, to make it come to life, to make people understand it, to know what is there. And for 33 years, that little baby who was born grew up, and he did just that. Jesus, through the four Gospels that you and I have, and then all the explanations of what happens to the church after that, are story upon story about how our God operates, who our God is. And if you want to know what God is like, you look at Jesus, because Jesus is God. He tells us how to deal with people that are broken. He tells us how to not put our trust in wealth. He talks about religiosity. And we have these four stories that tell us who this Jesus is. It doesn't just end with the manger. That's only the beginning. And if all you do is rush to Christmas and look at that cute little baby and do nothing more, you've done completely everything less. Because that baby is not God limited. It's God in a way that we can understand it. Not God that is muted so that we can't understand and know, but it's God on reserve in a sense for us that we can comprehend and we can understand and we can know Him. But sometimes we still don't get it. In fact, Jesus spent most of His time, most of His adult life with 12 guys, and He didn't pick the brightest, and so there's good news for us today. In fact, after spending 3 years constantly with them, constantly teaching, constantly talking to them, one of them, on the way when Jesus is going now to be that sacrificial lamb, one of them asked a really good question that's really a dumb question, all wrapped up in one. And Philip asked him and said, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough. And I don't know if frustration is a sin or not, and maybe there's no frustration in this. I would have been frustrated. And Jesus said it this way, have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How did God communicate to us who are limited in our perception and limited in our ability to be able to communicate to Him? Well, what He did was that He came so that we might know Him. Now, here's somebody you don't know, probably. Guy's name is Louis Casellas. You may not know him. Good-looking guy. Love the haircut. But from 1955 to 1974, Louis Casellas wrote for United Press International, UPI. He wrote an article every week called Religion in America. Anybody have any idea what I'm talking about? Anybody remember that? Okay, we have one. Very good. Two. That's awesome. Well, supposedly, Louis Casellas wrote an article week after week, trying to convince people to follow Jesus Christ. It's very unusual. We don't really do that in the day. Our reporters don't quite do that. But he was a newspaper man, and he was trying to communicate that, and he wrote this story, or at least it's credited to him, a story that he called the parable of the birds. You may have heard this. Louis Cassell didn't make it famous, but this guy sure did. This is Sunday of pictures of old people, so good job if you're here today, right? Those of you who are not old enough may not recognize this, but this was a little guy by the name of Paul Harvey, who for year after year after year read this same story, a story about a God who wanted to make himself known to us, that Louis Cassell wrote in the context of a story about a man and his birds. Will you take a listen?
The man I'm talking about was not a Scrooge now. He was a kind, a decent, a mostly good man, generous to his family and upright in his dealings with other men, but he just did not believe in all of that incarnation stuff which the churches proclaim at Christmas time. It just did not make sense, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. He could not swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as a man. He told his wife, I'm truly sorry to distress you, but I'm just not going with you to church this Christmas Eve. He said he'd feel like a hypocrite, that he'd much rather just stay home, but that he would wait up for them. So he stayed, and they went to the midnight service. Now, shortly after the family drove away in the car, snow began to fall. He went to the window to watch the flurries getting heavier and heavier. Then he went back to his fireside chair, began to read his newspaper. Minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound, and then another, then yet another. At first he thought somebody must be throwing snowballs against the living room window. But when he went to the front door to investigate, he found a flock of birds huddled out there miserably in the snow. They had been caught in the storm. In a desperate search for shelter, they had tried to fly through his large landscape window. That was what had been making the sound. Well, he couldn't let those poor creatures just lie there and freeze. So he remembered the barn where his children stabled their pony. That would provide a warm shelter. All he would have to do is direct the birds into that shelter. Quickly he put on a coat and galoshes, and he tramped through the deepening snow to the barn, and he opened the doors wide. And inside the barn he turned on a light so the birds would know the way in. But the birds did not come in. So he figured that food would entice them. He went back into the house and fetched some breadcrumbs and sprinkled those on the snow, making a trail of breadcrumbs to the yellow-lighted, wide-open doorway of the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs. The birds just continued to flop around helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them. He could not. He tried shooing them into the barn by walking around them, waving his arms, but instead they scattered in every direction except into the warm, lighted barn. And that's when he realized that they were afraid of him. They were afraid of him. To him, he reasoned, I'm a strange, terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know that they can trust me, that I'm not trying to hurt them but to help them. But how? Any move he made tended to frighten them and confuse them. They just would not follow. They would not be led or shooed because they feared him. And he thought to himself, if only I could be a bird now, if I could be a bird and mingle with them and speak their language and tell them not to be afraid, then I could show them the way to the safe, warm barn. But I would have to be one of them, wouldn't I? So they could see and hear and understand. At that moment, the church bells began to ring. The sound reached his ears above the sounds of the wind, and he stood there listening to the bells. Adeste Fidelis. Listening to the bells, pealing the glad tidings of Christmas, and he sank to his knees in the snow. Paul Harvey, I hope for you and those you love, this will be a wonderfully Merry Christmas.
Well, we do not have any freshly fallen snow for you to drop to your knees in, but that carpet will do just nicely. Do you know God? If you do not know Jesus Christ, He is the only one who has made the Father known. And there is no way to know the Father without knowing Jesus. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes this morning? He came so that we would be able to know Him. Our experience would not be enough because we would not be able to experience Him. He is so much greater and so much more powerful than we are. And though people could tell us about Him, until the first person knew about Him, there would be no way that anybody knew to tell anybody else. And so He took the remarkable step of becoming flesh. And not just becoming flesh, but dwelling among us, that we might know Him. To restore the relationship that was broken because of sin. The sin of Adam, the sin that we confirm every time that we sin, the nature that we have inherited, and the nature that we revel in. But it doesn't have to be that way. For those of us who will choose to know Him, those of us who will receive the light, those of us who will respond, we again can be in right relationship with Him because of the sacrifice of His Son. You see, that was God in the manger, which means that was God on the cross, which means sins can be forgiven, forgiveness can be found, salvation can be received if we but repent of our sin, turn from our ways, and turn toward Him. It's as if spiritually we would fall to our knees in humility, asking for the gift that has been given to us. Maybe today that's never happened to you. You've never done that. You've been a little standoffish with God. He hasn't done everything you wanted Him to do, and the relationships you don't have are right or perfect, and there's some challenges there. Maybe you're mad at Him for what He allowed to happen. Oh, in these moments, would you receive that which He's given to us through the baby born in a manger, the cross of Calvary? Or maybe today you know these things to be true, but somehow you've lost your way. You're more like the birds than the man in that story. You've kind of been caught in a storm, and it's been tough. In fact, Christmas is really tough. But you'll receive the calm assurance that there is a Father who loves us enough to sent his Son to redeem us back. And maybe that will give you the confidence that you need to continue on the rest of this year and into the next. Oh, Father, we're thankful that you have come that we might know you, that we can experience you through your Son, who is God in the flesh. Father, in these moments on this Christmas day, may we make commitments that last for all of eternity, because we make them in your strength and in your power according to your will. Father, help us to celebrate Christmas. And we ask these things in the name of the one who was and is to come, the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Would you stand to your feet? We're going to sing a song of response, a song of reflection. I know it's Christmas, and you're not supposed to make decisions, I suppose, on Christmas because all these people are here and all those things, but the altar is open this morning. I'll be down front if you want to pray with someone. Would you surrender to him what you have?